Okay, I'll just introduce you briefly, Matthew. So we need to talk about the populism in the room, or perhaps outside of the room. This agenda item was added by popular demand, and we invited Matthew because he has been looking at populism for quite a while in relation to climate, longer than most people studying it seriously. Matthew is at Sussex, but he has a background in think tanks and government in the UK, and he's looked broadly at populism in relation to climate and energy policies through the OECD. So welcome, Matthew. Matthew will give some remarks, and then we'll have a conversation.
So thanks very much, Karla, and thanks very much for inviting me. So, as Karla's saying, I've had an interest in populism and climate policy for a long time, over 10 years. And in the last 5 or 6 years, an enormous amount of academic research has come onto the scene looking at this relationship between populism, especially right-wing populism, and climate change. And I'm just going to run through with you briefly really what that literature says. I'm going to just briefly touch on what populism is, what's the relationship with climate change, why, and then also why, and then the question of does it really matter? Once populists get into power, what kind of effect do they have? A little bit of a disclaimer at the beginning. I'm mostly going to be wholly talking about really high-income countries, OECD countries, post-industrial countries, not the global south. So think Trump and Le Pen rather than Bolsonaro and Modi. And that's because the economic and the social and the political context are rather different and the dynamics are different. The other thing is that I'm going to focus on what people usually call right-wing populism, because that's really where the antipathy with the climate agenda comes from. Left-wing populists generally actually want a lot more urgent action on climate change. So that's the sort of focus. So I'll start off by, this issue of what is populism? What do we mean by populism? What do academics mean by it? And you may be familiar with this account that says it's a worldview in which there are no institutions, just the people, and the pure people. The people are good, and the heartland is good. And then there are these elites who rule us, and they are corrupt. But there are also, I think, important analyses which say there's a third party in this picture. And that's minorities who are seen in this worldview as responsible for distracting elites or corrupting elites and taking away their attention from the people. And they should be looking after the people, but they're distracted by these minorities. In a lot of populist concerns, this is immigrants. But in the climate field, it's climate advocates. It's you people in this room. You are the nefarious minority, as some analysts call them. So that's what we understand by populism, a very kind of particular worldview on politics and society. It's also important, obviously, and you'll be aware of this, populism is on the rise. It's obviously sort of broken through in America in a big way, but it's also on the rise in Europe over the last 20 years. A study of 31 European countries showed that the vote going to populist parties rose from 12% 20 years ago to over 30% now, and most of this is on the right. So this is a big, broad trend of emergence. At the moment, we have far-right parties in coalition governments in Sweden, in Finland, Netherlands, most recently Italy, Croatia, and so on. And we may have the Rally National coming through in France as well. And the other big change, I think, that's going on is that populist parties increasingly in Europe are beginning to appeal also to young people because mainstream parties don't seem to be able to solve the problems that affect them. Around housing, for example, which was a big issue in the Dutch election, and young people voting for Kurt Wilders helped really him kind of moving through. You also see it in Germany with the AfD. So that's the sort of background. So what about right-wing populism and climate change? We know that the right-wing populists are often primarily concerned with immigration. But the research shows very clearly that both supporters of right-wing populist parties and those parties themselves are more likely to be climate skeptic, more likely to be hostile to climate policy. I mean, for instance, a good example from the UK election would be Reform UK, which is the only party which wants to ditch net zero. So it's a very kind of clear message. And I would say this hostility to climate policy affects especially any kind of tax and any kind of regulation which can be constructed to be really intrusive in people's lives. In fact, renewables, now where we are with renewables and the economics of renewables, it's probably less problematic. Solar, in some senses, the economics of it are so good, it's likely to be less affected. But the kind of agenda on transport, on road transport, fuels, on heating in homes and so on, this is really tricky. Historically also, this antipathy used to be a lot stronger in Anglophone countries, in Australia under Abbott, Canada under Harper, and obviously the US under Trump. But it may also be now changing in Europe as well. We're seeing a stronger anti-climate aspect to European populism, right-wing populism. So what's going on? Why is this? And there's two kinds of explanation from research on populism, academic research on populism. One is kind of takes as reference point structural change in OECD countries over the last 30, 40 years, and an argument that right-wing populism appeals especially to what is in the media often called the left behind. Communities, peoples whose jobs, wages, or economic security have been undermined by a number of different factors: globalization, technical change, shift in the knowledge economy. And this group also feels sort of politically abandoned because a lot of mainstream parties, including centre-left parties, started to shift to try to win votes from middle-class professionals rather than the traditional kind of Labour group. And so this argument is then saying, well, why would these people be hostile to climate policies? They could be because they add to job losses and economic insecurities, say coal mining, steel decarbonisation. We're seeing in the UK, decarbonising steel might actually involve job losses, serious job losses. And it may also be because of a dislike of taxes in particular. This group is economically stressed, feels under a lot of economic pressure, and this is maybe the kind of thing that we saw in the Gilets jaunes phenomenon in France back in 2016. But I think there are limits to this argument, and we have to look a bit deeper into why right-wing populism is so hostile to the climate agenda. And I think it's also to do with ideology and values. So academics often say populism is a thin ideology. It doesn't really have much content in itself, and other values have to come in to kind of populate it and give it direction. And right-wing populism in the US and in Europe at the moment, and in other countries as well, it is socially authoritarian, but it's also very strongly nationalist or nativist. And what this means is that, when right-wing populists are thinking about these elites who they don't really like and who they feel ignored by, they think especially of cosmopolitan internationalist elites, and they think of the EU, and they think of international institutions. And in this context, climate change is often constructed in the populist worldview as a concern of cosmopolitan liberal elites who are this minority who are kind of drawing attention away from the people. I think it also is, you can see how it becomes problematic that a lot of the institutional mechanisms of the climate agenda are international, the science through the IPCC and the politics through UNFCCC. They're quite obscure to ordinary people. They're very distant. And so they make easy targets for populism. Okay, does it matter? Coming on to my final point, there's a lot of evidence, and it's quite systematic. We can all think of examples. Trump is a good example. We've just been discussing Trump. Geert Wilders has just come in the Netherlands. He wants to reverse Dutch policy on heat pumps. But there's much more systematic evidence in the academic literature that when populists get into the legislature in a big way, and especially when they get into the executive, then they do have a damaging impact on climate. They weaken climate policy. And this matters because populism is on the rise just at a time when rich countries need to be accelerating climate effort. They really need to be accelerating the rate of emissions reduction. And so they need to raise ambition and really deliver. But so it matters very much that populism can have this sort of slowing or dampening effect. It matters, I think, especially in countries where populist parties are dominant. It's pretty obvious. This can happen through what's called mainstream populism, Trump being the example in the US, where populist movements get into a center-right, mainstream center-right party and kind of take it over. And then they control the entire government agenda, including the climate portfolio. But you also see it in places where the populist parties are dominant, like in Poland with the PIS. In European countries with kind of coalition government and PR, it is somewhat different. Populist parties, right-wing populist parties, can weaken climate policy, but a lot depends on the response of the mainstream parties and whether they're willing to go into coalition with those parties and whether they're willing to let them set the agenda. I think I'll stop there. I don't want to run out of time, and maybe take up a few more questions with Karla.
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, come and join me. There's so much there. So again, we could have a whole day on this, and it's really important. I think I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, and also to somewhat get into what some of the responses might be, or kind of as you were starting to do, how do we perhaps think about neutralizing this? And for that part of it, I always find it, we need to kind of look at ourselves, right? As you said, either mainstream political parties, leaders, or climate advocates. But I wanted to pick up one thing on populists and climate impacts, and just get your sort of take on that. Because I think it is often said that populists in power or in leadership positions, it's difficult to ignore the very real climate impacts that people are experiencing, wildfires, extreme heat, drought, floods, and so on. But on the other hand, is it impossible to ignore those impacts, and what have you noticed in terms of populists responding to those kinds of impacts on their own populations?
Sure. I mean, I think with the right-wing populists, there's two ways this can go, or you see two things going on. One is that there's a series of fascinating studies which show that the way that people perceive extreme events like wildfires or extreme heat, droughts, and so on, is filtered through a partisan lens. And so in the US, there are these studies that show that exposure to the experience of wildfires makes people more pro-climate action if they are Democratic voters, but not if they're Republicans. There's also another study which I've seen in which, in response to a kind of real heat wave, again, different Tea Party Republicans would not acknowledge that there had been an unusually high temperature compared to other people. So I think that we have to. People will cling on to their perceptions, their worldview, in the face of events. The other way I think it can go, is perhaps more dangerous, which is the idea that if populists do say, okay, well, we can acknowledge that climate change is going on, it's going to have all these terrible effects, then you get into the sort of lifeboat ethics kind of territory, where people will double down on their hostility to the idea of climate migrants, for example, climate refugees, and want to kind of say, well, we're going to close our borders and we're going to dig ourselves in and look after ourselves in the face of climate change. Yeah,
thank you, Matthew. So let's, in final sort of question, and to touch on this, this is a big topic, but I did want to get your thoughts. I mean, in thinking about political language, about policy options, about institutions, what are the things that mainstream or non-populist, as you also mentioned, we can sometimes see populists there. What can we do in terms of thinking about how do we make our political systems, our language, more resilient against that populist attack against climate action?
I mean, I think here the interesting thing to look at is actually what's going on in the US with Biden and the IRA. He is trying to address two concerns, actually, of right-wing populists. So, creating manufacturing jobs and trying to kind of reintroduce a kind of status to a group of communities, but tie it to climate change or response to climate change. And he's also, in a way, saying, made in America. So this has a nationalist kind of element to it as well. It's difficult, I think, for some people to kind of take that on board, but that's clearly the intent of what he's doing to some extent. And we know that a lot of the investment is going to Republican states, or more investment is going to Republican states. So I think it's not a foregone conclusion, but I think it will be really interesting to see if Trump gets in, will the policy survive? There are also institutional reasons why Trump will find it hard to repeal it or remove it. But I think politically, that kind of strategy of sort of addressing what appear to be the concerns of populists may be one strategy which may work.
Thank you, Matthew. I think we're going to close there. That was a great finish and a great example, and obviously food for thought, picking up on what we see in the US. So thank you very much, and we'll finish there.